Hey everyone, this is the first episode of the ongoing history of RPGs. My name's Matt, and I'll be your guide. Today we're going to be looking at the first game in the Dragon Quest series, which was localized in North America as Dragon Warrior. Basically, the story behind this is that Dragon Quest was already a registered trademark in the States, ironically to another RPG, only a tabletop RPG, so it became Dragon Warrior for the purposes of avoiding confusion and not getting sued. Widely regarded as the first entry into the JRPG genre, Dragon Quest took influence from a number of places. In a 2007 interview with Retro Gamer magazine, series creator Yuji Horii explained that reading about text adventures that had become kind of popular in the North American PC game scene made him want to experiment with stuff that he could bring to Japan. In a quote from the interview, he said, "I read an article in a PC magazine about a US genre called adventure games, which allowed players to read stories on their PCs. We still didn't have them in Japan, so I took it upon myself to make one. The result of this was Portopia Renzoku Satsujin Jiken, or the Portopia Serial Murder Case, an adventure game run by a text parser, with the player inputting commands to influence the story. Basically, this played a lot like the Ace Attorney series of video games, which is actually a little bit more current, so you can kind of see the influence kind of going beyond this series of games. Since you technically couldn't lose this game at any point, it became really the first example of a visual novel, as opposed to a text adventure, an adventure game, where usually there is more than a few ways to get yourself killed." In the same interview, he said, "It was a program in which the story would develop through entering a command and by receiving an answer to it. It was exciting for me to imagine the reaction of the players playing with it." During the porting of Portopia to the Famicom, or the NES, Horii worked with a fellow developer named Koichi Nakamura. They combined their interests to create something new. In an interview with 1UP's Jeremy Parrish in August 2012, Nakamura explained, "During that time, Horii-san was really into Ultima, and I was really into wizardry, so both of us said, why don't we create a role-playing game? We were really into these role-playing games at the time, and that's how Dragon Quest started. After we finished Portopia, we started creating Dragon Quest." Horii's interest in bringing an RPG to the system also reflected the change from an arcade machine to the home console. In his words, the Famicom was a good system for games with no game over to worry about, which meant people could play longer stories in more than one sitting. The result of all this thinking was 1986's Dragon Quest for the Famicom and for the MSX series of computers. Starting off as a lone hero, your goal is to make yourself stronger through defeating monsters, rescuing a princess, and defeating the Dragon Lord in order to beat the game. Dragon Quest took Japan by storm and became immensely popular not only with gaming fans, but with the general public as well. While it's hard to think of an RPG without them today, gaining experience, gold, having your character grow, and be able to buy new equipment was completely new to the general public. Instead of having to learn a complicated RPG system like Ultima or Wizardry, which had a very more D&D and open-ended system in general, people could simply just pick up and play Dragon Quest. In an interview with Satoru Iwata leading up to Dragon Quest IX, Horii explained how simplifying the RPG experience was integral to its appeal. "The approachability was something we really focused on. For example, 7 points would raise you up to 1 level, and each time your character gained a level, he would clearly be stronger. For Dragon Quest, we dared to start out the character with various linear objectives. Once the player had achieved a series of clear-cut objectives, gradually building up the character's strength, they could eventually venture out on their own. This is probably best exemplified with the starting screen. Once you leave the king's castle in order to kind of venture out into the world and equip yourself, you actually see a cave or a castle right across the river. That's actually the final boss's lair. You just have to find a way to get to it." I decided to include Dragon Quest into this project mostly for its historical significance, because how cool is it that a couple guys who wanted to make something more accessible spawned an entirely separate genre? Some of the biggest games in history still use features introduced with Dragon Quest, and I think that's really cool. I also enjoyed how it turned out to be a good story of why speed is important when it comes to designing media. One of the reasons why Dragon Quest isn't as big in the West as something like Final Fantasy is because how it was released. It was released a full 3 years later than its release in Japan, which, by then, games like The Legend of Zelda and Final Fantasy made it seem pretty antiquated. The updated version for the North American audience actually had a couple refinements over the original Japanese release. Chief among this was the sprite actually facing the way that it was moving. In the Japanese release, everything faced down, so when you wanted to talk to someone, you actually had to specify the direction. The map was also updated, most notably with coastal tiles, so that the transition between land and sea didn't seem so jarring. Perhaps most importantly though, the ability to actually make a battery-backed save was included, because in the Japanese version you had to actually copy down a very long password in order to get your progress back. Even though the NES was supposed to be built for longer play sessions, they actually had to make some changes when it came to completing the game. At the time, the NES cartridge only had 64 kilobytes of data to work with, and in a conversation with Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto, Hori mentions that they actually had to take out suffixes of words and they had to take out different lines in order to make that space requirement. As time went on, other games pushed the boundaries in terms of what video games could do. The major example, of course, is like Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII comes out for the PlayStation, has full motion video, has 3D models, and then you look at Dragon Quest. Dragon Quest didn't really age that well. They didn't kind of push the boundary like other series did, so they kind of fell behind a little bit in prominence, and even though they were huge in Japan, it never kind of caught up to that level of madness, I guess, in the West. I came into the series relatively late. I came into the series with Dragon Quest VIII in 2004, and that's actually the only game in the series that I've played. That's why I'm really excited to actually go into Dragon Warrior for the NES. I want to see where the series has come from. I want to see how far it's evolved. Dragon Quest actually represents some simplicity for me, and that's another reason why I like it so much. Even though other games kind of push the boundaries and change how their battle system works, Dragon Quest and Dragon Warrior have always been about having very, very simple and straightforward mechanics, and that means that you can focus less on having to memorize like how to optimize the most amount of damage or how your character works, and you can just sit back and enjoy the experience. Open a menu, pick your action, target it, let it play out. Sometimes that's really all you need. Thanks for checking out the first episode of the ongoing history of RPGs. I'll be uploading episodes of my live playthrough of Dragon Warrior to this channel, so go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. If you want to watch live, you can also find a link to my Twitch channel in the video description. Bye for now.